So I got a couple of things. I don't know if you guys had anything you wanted to start with, but I got a couple questions
No,
written down.
they probably know everything I know, so they don't have questions for me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, I know last time we kind of talked about like the view of God. Really, there's like two major questions that over the past, I guess I sort of started looking into um the LDS Church probably like 3 or 4 years ago, but only like actually really putting a decent amount of time into it in the last, I'd say year and a half. And kind of the two like big topics, which I know we could spend hours and hours on each, but I just kind of wanted to get your all's thoughts on, was one kind of what we talked about last time with like one God, but also sort of there are other gods in one sense. So definitely wouldn't mind, again, getting your perspective on that.
Now,
Um,
what do you mean by that? One God and there's sort of other gods. What does that mean?
so quick backstory. I grew up in a Christian, like Protestant house, and
Okay.
then had a little bit of like a agnostic atheist phase in high school. And then kind of coming out of that, tried to like start from scratch, from reading the Bible for myself really for the first time. And I know everybody thinks they're objective, but tried to, as much as possible, put aside what I just been told to believe, because there wasn't a lot
So
of
which biblical scholars did you look into as you were searching through the Bible?
mostly like apologists, I would say, more than like theologians, some like Norman Geisler. But
What do you
even
mean apologists?
I guess they're like if you go on just YouTube or whatever, which I know isn't the
Mhm.
most academic way of doing it, but
Uh,
um, not really reading. Like I feel like I know a lot of people who read, like early church fathers, which I definitely want to do and need to invest more time in. But I guess like kind of the first thing that caught my attention about wanting to look into faith again was people who were making videos and podcasts and more, I guess, like modern books on here's kind of like the essential arguments for Christianity. So, um,
yeah, so you weren't studying biblical scholars, you were looking at Christian apologists.
yeah.
I'm confused.
And I know everybody thinks they're objective, but tried to, as much as possible, put aside what I just been told to believe. I mean, I would consider the apologists that I am still listening to, in one sense, biblical scholars.
You sure about that?
But I guess it kind of depends on your definition.
Yeah, so I mean training in linguistics, history, not focusing on theology, but actually studying the biblical text as history and diving into the ancient Israelites and their traditions, their beliefs, their practices, what they would have understood, placing the Israelite Hebrew text in their context. Somebody who's
E-
unconcerned about demonstrating or proving the Christian faith or the Israelite or Jewish faith, but simply just saying, here's the scriptures and the texts of Israel. Let's go through and try to understand how they would have viewed the world in their historical context.
Oh, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I guess getting started really not as much of that. I don't know if I shared with you guys now, but now I'm
So
like,
if you were
right.
agnostic atheist, why didn't you do that?
What do you mean?
So yeah, so I had a bout like that too, where I struggle. In fact, today I struggle with the belief that there's actually a God, but
Hmm.
I've decided that there is. But when I was going through mine, I didn't study Christian apologists or something like that. I studied people who didn't have a theological motivation for what they were doing. Instead, they were linguists, archaeologists, historians who were looking at these texts, people who are invested in anthropology and how the Israelite culture developed, what the biblical texts actually reflect as far as their historical nature, which stories are verified or validated by historical materials outside of the biblical text and which ones are not. That kind of a perspective. Have you done
Okay.
any work into those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I guess almost when I say apologist, that's kind of a loaded term because I know sometimes in some ways apologetics can be very like, just trying to win a debate and not really focused on the facts. So definitely in that regard,
Right.
I try to avoid that as much as possible. But yeah, I guess that's almost where I am definitely not a expert. That's kind of why I wanted to talk to you guys, is because I know a lot of times when you hear one group describe what another group believes, you're not going to get a totally accurate, unbiased approach. So I think I mentioned to you guys last time, like, I have Protestant family members and friends and even people I listen to online and stuff who will describe LDS beliefs, but I know almost kind of regardless of which different faith or sect or whatever you're talking about, it's better to hear it straight from people who actually have studied it and are, profess belief in that. So that's
Right.
why going through some of these questions, I think I know what you believe, but I don't want to bring it to the table and just assume I know
Okay.
everything you guys are saying. So,
Yeah.
um,
So what question did you have then from that perspective?
so the one we kind of touched on, which I guess I don't have a super pointed question, but I came across somewhat recently the King Follett discourse. Um, and so I guess I wanted to understand like your understanding of there's a couple verses specifically in the New Testament I'd written down, I mean
Well,
in the Old
what is
Testament.
the King Follett sermon?
Uh it's a speech, I think you guys were telling me actually more than I knew about it last time. It's a speech from Joseph Smith that's not part of like the Mormon like scripture, but was like a sermon, I guess, that I think was given at a funeral of whoever the King Follett was. Um, so there's actually kind of multiple questions in there about what's scripture, what's not, what comes from a prophet, if that like always is necessarily from God. But I guess really the biggest question I was kind of trying to come back to was biblically to me, which again, totally open to having my mind
What
changed.
do you mean? What do you mean by biblically?
Uh, the couple of verses, and again, that I've got here, I've got three or four from
No, but when
mostly
you
from
use the word
Isaiah.
biblically, what do you mean? Are you meaning just this is something that's found in the biblical text?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So like again, trying to myself kind of start from scratch and go to what I think is like the plain meaning of the text, which I know can be
What
off sometimes
plain
if
meaning of
we
what text?
of the various like Bible books that I'm reading from. Which again, I know even like saying the plain meaning is kind of a loaded term too, because everybody's got a
Yeah, because
different
there's no
take.
there's no such thing as a plain meaning. So
Everything becomes commonplace by explanation.
Yeah, well, I guess I think there's kind of exceptions to every rule, but I would say to an extent there's, at one
well,
point
no,
there is
I
a
mean
correct and a
specifically of the biblical text. I mean, certainly script, ancient documents written 2 to 3,000 years ago in ancient Hebrew and Koine Greek in a cultural context that you may not be familiar with are not going to be clear just because they're translated into English.
yeah, and that's what I mean. Like there definitely is something I could be missing, and that's why I almost kind of want to clarify if I'm reading these certain
Well,
verses that
yeah,
I have here
that's why
wrong.
you'd have to study. Yeah, you'd have to study the writings of scholars who are expert in those languages.
Okay, well then, yeah, I guess I'll kind of put the question out there. From my point of view, it seems like the multiple passages, like not just one taken out of context, but in different ways, are making the case that there is only one God, and not only like in the sense of only worship this one God, but like he's always existed into the past as God and into the future.
Right? Wrong.
And then when I came across the King Follett discourse, it seemed to be like as blatantly contradicting that as I could imagine. But that's where I want to, try to challenge what I assume to be true about, what I'm reading on both ends about what Joseph Smith said and what these passages are saying to try to get a different
Well,
point
I
of
guess
view.
before we get there, can you tell me what do you understand about Israelite monotheism?
So I've done a little bit of digging, definitely should,
Yeah,
read up
so
more.
tell me what you know about Israelite monotheism so we can kind of understand what you're talking about.
So I know it's again, language can be kind of loaded, but from what I can tell, all of Old Testament records show that the Israelites were kind of aware of either idols, or you could even make the argument that it's like some kind of supernatural power, whether it be, I don't know, demons probably wouldn't be quite the right word, but there's like spiritual warfare going on. But they're in the terms of like the ultimate creator God who they're supposed to worship, that's kind of like the main teaching of the whole Old and New Testament. Um, and that's why those verses in particular that I was going to in
Well,
Isaiah.
an ultimate creator God in what context? So again, you're talking about the scriptures of Israel. These were written by Israelites for Israelites. So obviously any group or culture in that time that's talking about the God is going to talk about their God. And
Yeah, but
they're gonna place their God in preeminence over other gods, which begs the question of why have you selected to worship the God of Israel?
yeah, well, it's almost, I guess you have to take like the argument they're making as a kind of a coherent whole.
What do you mean a
Again,
coherent
I'm not
whole?
saying that these passages I'm going to, like if I read a passage that says there is only one God, I think it would be circular to say that like proves there is only one God. But I guess the point I'm trying to get at is more like if the Bible is saying one thing, kind of regardless of if it's true or false, and then Joseph Smith said something against
Well,
it.
The Bible doesn't say things. The Bible is a collection of independent documents you have to interpret. They certainly aren't cohesive.
So would you say the Bible is saying there are more than
I'm sorry, you
one
cut out.
gods in the
No, you're fine. Yeah, so I missed what you said.
yeah, I was just getting at like even beyond just the Bible, let's say one book, for example, something like Isaiah, which I know again you could probably study Isaiah for a lifetime and not get to the bottom of it. But regardless of if one is like proving one is true or false, I guess my question is more like trying to get at, okay, if the Bible, this book of the Bible is saying one thing, and then Joseph Smith is saying something
Well,
contradictory to
what's it
it.
saying that's contradictory to what Joseph Smith was saying? I guess outline what your problem is so I can quit cutting you off with dumb questions. So what
Yeah.
exactly is it that you think the King Follett sermon is? Because I don't think you know what the King Follett discourse actually is. I don't think you've done any study, and you certainly haven't read the source material on it. Um, but what do you think it's saying?
So going, I've got the quote here in front of me. The King Follett quote that I've got here is, "We," which again, I guess we would have to be discussed who we is talking about, but presumably talking to somebody who believes in God. But kind of regardless of that, we have imagined and supposed that God was God from all eternity. I will refute that idea and take away the veil that you may see. So that's kind of the one hand. And then that like specific quote in there, God was God from all eternity. I will refute. And then comparing that to, there's three or four verses here from Isaiah, but the one says, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Um, is there a God beside me? I know not one.
I'm sorry. I missed you were reading the King Follett sermon. I completely lost sound. What were you saying? So reread the King Follett sermon portion you were
Yeah. Yeah. So the quote is, we have imagined and supposed that God was God from all eternity, but I will
right.
refute that idea and take away the veil that you may see. So, like,
Uh-huh.
specifically that sentence of God was God from all eternity, I will refute that.
Mhm.
And then,
So taking that statement completely out of its larger context of what the sermon is historically, you're going to reach a conclusion as to what it means. So what does it mean in context?
that's where, again, I'm open to, I want to hear your point of view, but to me, saying,
Well, it's not a point of view. It actually is what it is. So the in its historical context, that statement has a specific meaning. And if you understand the development of what the King Follett sermon is, the question, if you're believing that Joseph Smith is supporting the idea that God was not God and that he became God, that is not what the sermon is saying.
so what does it mean then when it says, I will refute that God was God from, or God was God from all
He's talking
eternity?
about he's in context of what King Follett was delivered for. he's talking about a characteristic or attribute of God that was not eternally possessed by God, but was obtained.
What was that
His
characteristic then?
his having a body.
But it doesn't, I mean, again, I'm trying to be open-minded, but
I suppose so.
in that sentence specifically, it
I
doesn't
know if you
say we
just read one
imagine.
sent I know if you just read one sentence and remove it from the context of any document or statement or what somebody's saying, you can make it mean whatever you want. But if you actually place the statement into its broader context, it actually has specific meaning. So you don't know what King Follett is. It's a general conference talk delivered in April of 1844, just prior to the death of Joseph Smith, and it was in he gave it in reference to King Follet, who was a friend of his who had died in an accident. He was crushed, but we don't actually have the King Follett sermon because it's not a sermon. It's four different versions or accounts of four different authors writing down what they heard, and we don't have it in its totality or completeness. So what you're reading is you're reading a composite of those four accounts that's published by the church in I think it was in 1972 or 3 is what you're reading, but it's not actually what he said because he actually discoursed for close to 2 to 3 hours, but you can read what is published by the church in about 20 minutes. But
Okay, so
what is the function or purpose of the sermon? What's the topic that he's talking about?
I don't have the whole thing, but from I remember like right before that, or maybe not right before, but like a couple paragraphs before, he's talking about how like I guess what I would refer to as God the Father,
No, he has one subject that he's talking about. He's addressing one specific subject in the entire sermon. What is that subject?
yeah, I'm not sure beyond those couple of paragraphs.
Well, what do you think? If he's giving a lecture or a sermon to commemorate the death of somebody, and as he says in the beginning, to console the mourners, what would be a consoling doctrine for mourners who are sad somebody is dead?
Probably something about like kind of what's to come in the afterlife would be my guess.
Or resurrection?
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. What do we have for her, Johnny?
Yeah, so the primary subject of the sermon is resurrection. He talks about some other ancillary topics, but he's specifically talking about resurrection. And just prior to this sermon, in 1843, we had revealed Doctrine and Covenants, section 130, verse 22, which states that God the Father has a body of flesh and bone, as does the Son, Jesus Christ. So all he's saying in that sermon is that God didn't always have that body, that just like Jesus, he entered into a mortal experience to receive that body, and he has a glorified body of flesh and bone, the same as Jesus Christ does. That's what he's
Okay.
saying.
But I guess my question would be, even if that's like the larger context of
Well, that's
the
what that's what the purpose of the sermon is.
yeah, so that's the purpose of the sermon. That one sentence still doesn't seem to convey that to
It
me.
does, because he's conveying that he didn't always have the body that he has now. You had imagined and supposed that God was as he is now always, and he's not. He obtained his body through a mortal experience, the same as Jesus Christ did. If you actually keep reading the sermon for the remainder of it, he explains that quite clearly.
Okay. Well, yeah, well, I'll have to probably be smart is just to go back and read the whole thing.
Where did you get that quote? Because you haven't read the
This was the
sermon, so you
one
didn't get it from reading the sermon. Where'd you get the quote?
I got this. I copied and pasted a couple of different ones. I think it was from the LDS
Yeah.
website where they have
I
the
know, but you wouldn't have that quote out of its context. So if you had pulled it from the LDS website, it would have actually explained the quote, and you wouldn't be confused about its meaning.
well, they have the full whatever it's not. I know it's like not like an exact transcript, but the full compiled version on the website of the speech.
Yeah, in two parts. Yeah. Did you read both parts?
No, just the one that I'm saying, the
Yeah,
kind of
because
introductory one.
it was published in two different magazines a month apart. So that one it was published in April and May. And so half of it's in one edition and half it's the other. So even finding both parts of it on the LDS website is difficult to do because
Yeah,
of that.
but
You
the quote
actually have
was
to
still
know what
from
you're
the
looking for.
LDS website
Right,
originally.
but I don't think that you pulled it from the sermon. I don't think you've read the sermon. That's what I'm saying. And you actually haven't read the whole thing, certainly. I'm just wondering where else you got it.
I mean, I don't mean to be too confrontational, but I'm telling you, I pulled it from the website, and then you just admitted it is on the website, but now you're just saying you doubt that I pulled it from
No,
the
no,
website.
I don't think you went to the website, typed in King Follett Discourse, searched the sermon, found that quote, and pulled it from there. I think that you got the idea to do that from somewhere else, and I'm wondering where that was.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, yeah, no,
Somebody told you about this quote and told you that you can use it to contradict Isaiah 43:10 or something
well,
like
no,
that.
yeah, no, I'm totally transparent with that. It was probably actually more than one source.
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of the name of the guy. I think, who's the guy? Sorry, we were talking with last time. Was it Chris, Mr. Christopher? I think he mentioned. I can't think of the guy's name right now, but he's a popular like anti-Mormon apologist. Kind of like curly hair. You guys would probably know him if you saw him, but definitely,
Chris,
again, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm totally transparent with getting some of these ideas from people who are
yeah, yeah,
like
yeah. So if you're
trying
getting it, yeah,
to,
so if you're getting it from an antagonist, that's what I was wondering is if you got it from an antagonistic source. Yeah. So
yeah. But then that's
yeah.
why I tried to, try to do as much diligent research as I could, and I still haven't read the part two if there is one, like you're saying. But try to go to the original
And then so you
document.
did, so you quoted and then you cut out. So you quoted that statement from King Follett, and we've addressed that. It's not talking about the fact that God wasn't always God. It's just talking about he didn't always possess his physical body. So what was the other quotes that you wanted to do or scriptures?
So if really, yeah, kind of like big picture, again, kind of have a million little questions I know we could dive into, but the second biggest one, and again, full transparency, getting these ideas or hearing the arguments from people who aren't part of the LDS Church, who are trying to refute it, but that doesn't necessarily make them right or wrong. But from what I can tell, kind of one of the other like biggest objections is the whole Book of Abraham translation process, uh, which again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I know there's like even sub questions that can
So
be.
what was your, so you're just saying you didn't agree with that quote from King's Follett. You didn't have anything else that for why? Because I mean, even if the quote was as you understood it, what would be the big deal about that?
What was that quote? And then even again, a couple lines before, which I don't want to now take those out of context if I was missing something there. But I
Mhm.
guess the kind of large argument was if this of what Joseph Smith said contradicts a book of the Bible, like which one would be more trustworthy or reliable? That's where I was trying to
Joseph
get
Smith.
just a
Yeah, Joseph Smith would be.
okay. But
Yeah.
then yeah, that's I guess kind of what
That's like saying if Jesus contradicts Moses, which one do you pick? Or if Paul contradicts the author of John, which one do you pick? Or if Peter contradicts um, Samuel, which one do you pick? You
yeah,
pick
well
the
I don't
most
want
current one.
to
You pick the most current one. You just say, well, Peter is interpreting him or whatever. He's not contradicting him. You give preference to the living modern guy because you believe that they're in the same line of authority.
yeah, and no, I totally see what you're saying there because that does make sense just in terms of like
Yeah.
from a
So
purely
if
historical.
Joshua started saying something different than what Moses did, then they still follow Joshua. They don't argue with Joshua that he's disagreeing with Moses.
Well, yeah, and that's where I guess we could. I, I don't think it'd be there'd be not enough time right now, but in terms of like how I guess God inspired different books of the Bible. I know there's tons of different views on. Some people think it was, not very specific. Others are like hyper literal, where every single word is exactly perfect. But I guess my current belief, from what I can tell, is that at least on like the bigger picture questions of kind of what is God like and the essentials of, or what most people would consider like the essentials of biblical teaching, there won't be any contradictions within books of the Bible. And from what I understood last time, which correct me if I'm wrong, but you guys would say, generally speaking, with Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, the Bible, they should all be kind of coherent. At least I know there's probably a little minute historical
Well, yeah,
detail, but in terms
they're
of
gonna
like,
be as yeah, so they're gonna be as coherent as the scriptures of Israel would be because and as coherent as the New Testament could be, certainly. I mean, the Book of Mormon we don't believe it was written by Joseph Smith. We believe it's a transmission of an ancient record, so he didn't write it. But the Doctrine and Covenants would be internally consistent because he produced that. Well, except for a couple of revelations in it.
yeah, well, that's actually kind of what, again, starting maybe from not the best place of listening to people who are antagonists,
Yes.
but trying to get to the actual firsthand resources to make a decision for myself. That's why the Book of Abraham thing kind of caught my attention because, again, from somebody who's not, or at least wasn't raised in the LDS church, you hear a million different crazy opinions out there. Again, many people of which probably haven't looked into it for themselves.
What? For real?
Full transparency, getting these ideas or hearing the arguments from people who aren't part of the LDS church who are trying to refute it.
Oh, there's a big surprise!
Um, when I'm looking at, and I've read through twice now, or might have been 3 or 4 times over the last couple years, the basically all the firsthand evidence I can get, plus the article on the translation of the Book of Abraham on the LDS website, I still have some, I guess, questions or concerns there.
Okay.
Um, but I guess you're probably generally familiar with some of those arguments. So,
I don't have any concerns because I probably just I don't see an issue really with it. But
so I mean, it's again, there's kind of a couple different pieces of the puzzle that have to be discussed. But again, going to, I got a little while ago a Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and all that, and in like the intro when he says the writings of Abraham, or yeah, the writings of Abraham while he was in Egypt, called the Book of Abraham, written by his
Mhm.
own hand. That's, I guess, kind of my first question is, I know not written by his hand necessarily means like he actually touched this piece of paper. Like if I wrote a book and then made a copy of the book, you could kind of say in one sense it was written by my hand.
Right.
But I guess kind of that question number one would be like, why say written by his hand if the actual like papyrus that we have now don't seem to be like having anything to do with something he would have written, if that makes sense.
Uh,
I didn't
well,
form
for the
that
same
question very
reason,
well, but
well, for the same reason, the Book of Mormon begins with an introduction that's written by Mormon, because that's what the text would have said. So if I wrote this with my own hand at the beginning of a document, anybody who then copies that document is going to write that same thing at the beginning of it.
yeah, but I guess this, and again, I'm could be missing some information here because I'm not by any means an expert, especially on the Book of Mormon. But like I guess from what my understanding, this book is kind of in a category of its own because of the element of the papyrus scrolls kind of being in the
What
equation.
what element? Well, we don't
Like,
have the Book of Abraham scrolls. We don't have the papyrus that's the Book of Abraham. We don't have them.
I'm referring to the ones that were recovered or whatever from
Yeah,
the,
they're not the Book of Abraham. They're a Book of the Dead.
yeah, that's I guess.
Yeah, so they're not the Book of Abraham. So in fact, I've got a friend, my friend Stephen Smoot. You can look him up. I mean, he can sit and read them to you because he's an Egyptologist, and they're just simply not the Book of Abraham.
But then, so like for example, the first facsimile image in there, if that is in Mormon scripture saying this is the writings of Abraham, but then you're saying it's not the writings of Abraham, then I guess I'm confused there how to put those pieces together.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding your question. What do the facsimiles have to do with it?
So, as far as I understand, the papyrus that Joseph Smith was using that he said were,
Was
again,
lost in the Chicago fire.
but then I thought the church confirmed that those papyrus that we have now that have facsimile one, I
No, they've
think two.
specifically confirmed that they're not. So the papyrus that hold the facsimiles that we do have, right? Those are probably the same facsimiles. Yes, but the text is not the Book of Abraham.
Let's add listening to your already impressive list of skills.
But we know that he had more text that was sold after his death, and those were burned in the Chicago fire.
Okay. Well, I have a couple questions there then. I guess the first one would be with that, the first facsimile.
Mhm.
How, I guess, do you like reconcile the seeming contradiction between what like an Egyptologist would say is the like the theme or the characters in the picture versus Joseph saying that they're Moses and, other things other than the original Egyptian context?
So some of the characters he did get right, consistent with what Egyptologists say, and some of them may have been him adapting the image for another function or purpose.
Okay. And I guess
So it's
that's
like if I
where,
have a picture, if I have a picture on a cave wall across time, different people are going to interpret it differently. The same way that in the New Testament, you've got the New Testament authors pulling texts from the Hebrew scriptures and claiming that they are messianic and refer specifically to Jesus, even though they don't.
but then when you say he got some parts of it correct, which I've
Well,
seen,
meaning that there's overlap. So what he is actually transmitting in his interpretation of the facsimiles is consistent with what Egyptologists also would say, and some of it's not. There's a book you can read. In fact, if you want to, my friend Stephen Smoot, let me share my screen real quick. So this book is called A Guide to the Book of Abraham.
okay. Let
It
me
actually
stop.
goes through all of this material. I don't
Okay.
have the book memorized. I read it about a year ago. And so, but if you'll
Yeah.
go through this book, it actually answers all of those questions in quite a bit of detail.
Okay. Gotcha. Well, yeah, I'm definitely open to that.
And if
I
you
feel like
still
because
have
again,
concerns after that, then I can put you in touch with Stephen Smoot. I don't know John Gee or Kerry Muhlestein personally, but I do know Stephen Smoot quite well. He's a friend of mine.
okay, awesome. Yeah, I definitely
But
be
and then he's produced YouTube videos and things like that, actually answering and addressing a lot of these questions. They're very common questions. Basically, the shtick is that the way the story goes, as with the King Follett sermon, somebody quotes that portion of the sermon, then compares it to some passages in Isaiah and says, ha ha, contradiction. But really what they're doing is reflecting that they don't understand either the King Follett sermon or Isaiah is what they're doing. Similarly with the Book of Abraham, they're saying, hey, you've got on papyrus by the hand of Abraham, haha, but the papyrus themselves don't date to the right time period, and the papyrus are not, they don't contain the Book of Abraham, and this facsimile is disagreed on by this Egyptologist. He addresses all those arguments, and they're pretty sophisticated arguments.
okay. Well, yeah, like I said, I'll definitely look into it because I
Yeah.
figure most of the time when I'm searching this stuff, you come up with you get a lot of search results that are again contrarian, like you're saying. Actually, I feel like I found maybe one or two videos that were from trying to defend the position. So that's
Yeah,
definitely
just
good
look.
to know
Yeah,
because
just it's called A Guide to the Book of Abraham. It's by Stephen Smoot. He actually goes through and responds to everything. They summarize a lot of the scholarship that's been done over the last 30 years, and they produce some of the most recent scholarship that's been done in the Book of Abraham. Um, the onomasticon of the Book of Abraham is probably the best evidences for it. The naming of places and dates and people and things like that were verified by later antiquity is probably the best evidences in support of the text of the Book of Abraham and its claim that Joseph Smith received it as a transmission from God. So, but the problem that people have is they say, well, we found this papyrus. When we translated it, it's not the Book of Abraham, which the church has conceded since 1970s, but that's the case. We never claimed that it was. So that's just an argument that makes no sense to us because it's like, hey, that thing that you say is the book of Abraham is not the book of Abraham. And our response is that thing that you say we say is the book of Abraham. We agree with you. It's not the book of Abraham. And so
Yeah,
then we're
and
left
then
with what's the issue?
yeah, I mean, I'm like I said, I'm definitely hoping to read the book and I'll look into it. So maybe in one sense, we should just kind of
Yeah.
put a pin in the conversation
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
circle back to
So
it. But it's the
yeah,
one,
just take some
two.
time and work through that book. It's available for free online.
Oh, okay,
It's a PDF.
gotcha.
It's a downloadable PDF.
Yeah. Well, I guess it didn't then just one or two like more quick questions. And maybe this is something I'll just have to read up on more. But when you say like uh, the church agrees that the papyrus isn't the book of Abraham,
Yeah, that's the official position of the church is the papyrus that we have is not the Book of Abraham. That's
but
just not even a
then
debatable position. We all know John Gee, Kerry Mulestein, and Stephen Smoot, those Egyptologists, along with Hugh Nibley, also, and John Thompson, they will all tell you this is not the Book of Abraham. These texts that we have, this 6 or so foot of papyrus that was recovered, is not the Book of Abraham.
yeah,
It's
but I
a it's
mean,
a it's a common funerary text, the Book of Breathings. What makes it unique is that it is the only such copy of that document that has facsimiles.
oh, you mean the papyrus is the only one like
Yeah,
that?
it's unique. Yeah, it's unique in that it has those facsimiles attached to it.
Well, then yeah, that's kind of where my question is though, is like if
I know.
it's
So
not
people say, well, it's
the
got the facsimile, so this must be the text. It's not the text. Yeah, I know how the argument goes. Yeah, but it's just it. The problem with it is there's a lot of presuppositions that go into that argument. Like we don't know what the full scroll, we don't know what was done, we don't know why they were. There's a whole chapter in that book about why those facsimiles may have been included in that specific copy of the Book of the Dead and how it would have been found at a specific library location, why it would have been there, and actually even who owned it and why it would have contained the facsimiles that it does. Kerry Mulestein's done quite a bit of work on the fact that it was a common practice that we kind of eject from our head. So if you ever looked at a textbook and you open up a textbook and sometimes it'll talk about something and it'll say, see figure 6 on page 11, but you're on page 64. And so you have to turn back to page 11 to see the figure that's associated with page 64. So that kind of a thing happens in Egyptian texts, papyrus, where they will actually
okay.
reference a picture or some kind of a graphic that's contained in a different scroll.
Okay. And I was trying to look here because that actually reminds me, I thought there was a verse somewhere in the first chapter. That's probably what you were referencing, where it says something like see facsimile from the beginning of this paper or something like
Yeah.
that. That's, I guess, where I was wondering, you kind of just explained it, but if the papyrus that we have now is not the Book of Abraham, but the
It's
text,
not. No. That's not even if. It's just not. The
yeah, so
papyrus we
it's
have now, not the Book of Abraham.
okay, so
Nobody,
it's not the Book
nobody,
of
nobody's
Abraham.
arguing that it is. Yep.
Yeah.
In fact,
But
only
then
only anti-Mormons argue that it was. No Mormon argues that that's the Book of Abraham.
but then
Clearly not.
that picture is the Book of Abraham in the sense of like it is in the
The
scripture.
yeah, those facsimiles are there, but yeah. But
But so
again,
then
read the chapter on that in Stephen's book.
yeah, but just so I'm clear
I
though, so
mean, if you want me to, I can
the
just read the chapter to you about the
well, I was just looking for
facsimiles.
the specific answer to if you're saying everybody agrees this is not the Book of Abraham, but
Yeah,
the picture from that thing that's not the Book of Abraham made it into the scripture of what Joseph Smith said was the Book of Abraham.
yeah,
Wouldn't
yeah. He
that be
inserted
a
the facsimiles. Would it be a what?
sorry, say that again?
Yeah, he inserted facsimiles. Yeah, there were published facsimiles that he interpreted. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But again, I'm trying to reconcile in my mind. Again, I totally will definitely read.
Reconcile what?
It to me, it seems like a contradiction to say it's clearly not the papyrus is clearly not the Book of Abraham. But then when I have
what
Mormon
assumption
scripture,
are
it
you having?
says,
What are you having as an assumption about those facsimiles that leads you to believe that there's a problem?
well, not even
What
an assumption,
assumption are
but
you?
you telling me that that the papyrus is not the Book of Abraham,
The
which I
papyrus
agree.
is not the Book of Abraham. Yes, nobody
But
will,
if
no person will disagree that the papyrus, the text of the papyrus is the Book of Abraham. That's not true. What the facsimiles are found in, are published with translations. Yes, but they're also not the Book of Abraham.
so, the Book of Abraham that's in
Yeah,
the
the text of the Book of
scripture.
Abraham, its chapters. Yeah, they're not in that papyrus. That material is not does not come from those papyrus. That's correct. But those facsimiles are found in those, at least two of them.
Okay. So basically, the papyrus are not the Book of Abraham, but that was used as like almost a starting point to write the Book of Abraham.
No.
So
Have
then
you
what about
read,
all
wait,
the
have you
other
read the book?
stuff?
Have you read the Book of Abraham?
Not in its entirety, no.
What does that mean? How much of it have you read?
It's probably a while ago now when I first, maybe the first two chapters or three. I forget exactly how
Okay.
much, but not much of it.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just not, you're trying to say that there's a problem because the facsimiles are there. And I just explained the facsimiles being contained in the published document in the Pearl of Great Price does not mean that those facsimiles mean the text, that the papyrus that they're attached to is the Book of Abraham. And I just explained why.
Yeah,
Those
and I'm not.
facsimiles being included or transmitted does not mean that the text that's attached to them is being claimed to be the Book of Abraham, because that text is obviously not the Book of Abraham.
Yeah, and I'm not even talking so much about the text as much as like the specific question of like the content of the not again
Facsimiles,
not
yeah.
even yeah, but not even like the what do you call it? The little explanations, but like the actual image itself. The content in the image is the Book of the Dead image,
No,
basically.
it's not
Just
though. Those facsimiles are not the Book of the Dead either. The book of horror. That book is the text that's not in the facsimiles. The facsimiles are separate from that. And that's what I'm saying. This is the only copy of that text that we have, this Book of Breathings that we have, that has facsimiles attached to it.
yeah, I think I'm not phrasing the question very well. Like almost just saying he like Joseph Smith used the images from the Book of the Dead as like a starting point, I guess you could say,
Not a starting point.
to
We don't know what the process was of his translation. No, I don't have any idea what he began with or how he started or anything like that. I don't
okay.
know. Yeah, by the starting point, you see, again, you're assuming something. You're bringing assumptions into it. All I know is what we have, right? What we have is we have this text that we call the Book of Abraham. It's not found in the papyrus that we have. It's just not. So that papyrus is not the source of that text. Then we have facsimiles. The facsimiles, we have those, two of them, and they're found in the Book of Abraham. And there are
Yeah.
interpretations of what those facsimiles mean.
Yeah. I guess I'm just
And
having trouble understanding like it seems a little bit like a word game sort of to say like this image basically comes from the papyrus, but since it's not literally the papyrus, it's not from the papyrus and it's a totally
again, like I said, it's that there is an image attached to a document does not mean that that image doesn't correlate to that document. You're
yeah, but I'm not
assuming that because they're together, they must correlate, and that's not a proper assumption.
well yeah, but not even talking about the text. I mean just focused on the image. The image is from the
Which
papyrus.
makes no
That's
sense to me.
well yeah, I mean ultimately you have to look at them together, but I'm saying if we were just discussing the image and I came to you and I said, here's a papyrus that I translated from this papyrus, and here's the translation and explanation.
Uh-huh.
And then you said, this translation and explanation has nothing to do with the thing that I got it from,
Why? And
you'd
that's
have
not true of
to.
the papyrus. No, of the facsimiles. No, you'll have to read the chapter in the Book of Abraham on
Yeah,
that.
and again,
Yeah,
I totally
yeah.
will. But I'm just
Read that. I'm not the expert on this, so you'll. That's why I'm telling you read the book on it.
okay.
I suppose so.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely will. And that's why I was want to get your all's opinion. Like, again, I'm probably not
But
phrasing the question very
what
well,
would be
but
the relevance of our opinion when there are scholars who've written a book on it? You can just read the book.
I
I don't
mean,
have a strong opinion on that.
I
If you
guess
want me to, if you want an opinion that I would consider valid, I can open up that chapter on the facsimiles and read the chapter to you. But that's
yeah, no, I
about all
mean
I'm going to be able to do.
and that's what I'm totally open to that. I give you my word unless I forget. I'll
Yeah,
do
so
my best to
you can just do it on
read
your
the
own. I mean,
yeah.
if you've got it, yeah, anybody with any
Um,
integrity that's looking into things would actually read the actual religion's scholarship on the topic rather than just Googling some random facts. You'd want to go to wherever the scholarship is found on those issues and read that. So like if I want to study what a Reformed Baptist believes, I don't just talk to a Reformed Baptist. I go read their literature and I read the materials that they produce and try to understand their theology from those who are trained experts in their theology.
yeah, and I guess the one I guess kind of I'm biased to everybody's biased, but I'm definitely biased in the way because again, thinking back like in my home church, it was very like productionized, like don't look into things for yourself, kind of don't ask questions, which I think is not at all the right way to do things. You should be able to feel free to ask questions and stuff. But I know
Right.
personally, even my some family and friends and pastors I had growing up, when like a question, really, I wasn't even bold enough to ask questions back then, but a lot of the times they would kind of phrase it as like, uh, there is a Christian scholar out there who does have the answer to that question.
Right.
They kind of couldn't give it themselves. So that's why, like, I know
Well,
in
and
a
even
sense,
if they could, it wouldn't be authoritative because Protestantism doesn't have an authoritatively binding cohesive theology.
yeah. But I mean, I was just making the point more generally, though, that like, while there are, it's totally worthwhile and you should, like you said, as a starting point, like go to the scholars in the field. When it comes to like kind of not really big picture, but like essential questions of any certain belief, I feel like those kind of like need to be answered. Not, it's not always going to be a simple answer, but like everybody should have an answer to kind of the biggest objections or roadblocks, I guess, if that makes sense, to a certain
Why?
belief. Like in order to say I believe X, I should have like the at least like the essentials. Not everybody's going to be a,
Well, the essential for
PhD.
Latter-day Saints is the fact that we have a living prophet and apostles today.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that was kind of a weird way to phrase it, but like when I say essentials, I mean almost like biggest objections. Like if I was a total atheist and then, said I want to go from an atheist to being a Christian.
Well, if you were trying to do that, my only thing would be is I guess you're going to have to decide if you believe in God or not.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like
It's
for
not
just
up
for
to me to
example,
prove it to you. It's
but
God's
like one,
responsibility to prove that he exists.
yeah, but like one specific question that journey would be like, okay, I think most everybody would agree, you have to believe in the resurrection of Jesus to kind of be going down that Christian road. And then I know
Apparently
there's
not.
probably,
Some of Paul's followers didn't believe in a literal resurrection. I talked to a Christian the other day that said he doesn't believe in a literal resurrection.
okay, well then, yeah, I guess there's exceptions to every
And
rule. But
he's a Protestant, believes in the Trinity, but just doesn't believe that Jesus was bodily resurrected in the way that most people claim that he was, or that Luke. He thinks that Luke 24 is a metaphor.
hmm. Well, yeah, and I mean, again, there's totally a wide range of views on any question from any, just about any belief.
Right.
But for me, that's why, again, the whole Book of Abraham thing, like in one sense, I know it isn't like the whole essential foundation of anybody's faith. But to me, given that that is like I think from what I understand, probably like the most popular
What is it that
objection.
you think that a Latter-day Saint would use as an analysis for determining what the Book of Abraham is? What would be the basis of the analysis? So let's say Joseph Smith produces the Book of Abraham and he's wrong. Let's say that he's wrong about the facsimiles and he's wrong about the text. So that means we don't read the Book of Abraham.
Well, no, see, I think that's actually kind of where my biggest picture question for you guys would be if, and this might not be true for everybody, but if I found out that a prophet, regardless if it's Joseph Smith or one of the, Old Testament, New Testament, whatever prophets, if like something specifically regarding like them saying this is a prophecy from God,
Mhm.
if that turns out to be false, it seems to me, I mean, biblically, but not even just biblically, but like common sense wise, I wouldn't trust other things that that same person said were from God, if that makes sense.
I don't know. By prophecy, how are you defining the word prophecy in that context?
I guess like if the person giving the message specifically states like this is not of
Yeah,
my own,
so
this is a
so
message
Joseph
from
Smith
God.
said, "Here's the Book of Abraham. It's an account of Abraham written by his own hand on papyrus." And he transmits that document. He doesn't claim that he understands Egyptian. He has no
Hmm.
understanding at all of the Egyptian language. He never claimed to. Any transmission of any text that he produced would have been by God allowing him to understand it. So even in
Yeah.
looking at the papyrus with the hieroglyphic characters that are on it, the characters that are actually on the papyrus, he would never have been able to in a million years on his own understand those characters. In fact, at the time he did this, nobody would have. And yet he still produced the Book of Abraham. So the question is where did he get the Book of Abraham? Well, if he says, I got it from these papyrus that I can't read it all, and God told me what to say, then for a Latter-day Saint, you have more than one option. One of the options is that Joseph Smith, and this is some people's belief in the church, Joseph Smith believed that he was translating these papyrus. He wasn't, but God was telling him something that Abraham had written about himself, and he was receiving it by revelation, which is precisely what you believe about the book of Genesis.
Hmm.
Every problem is absurdly simple when it is explained to you. Pum, pum.
Yeah, but
So I
that's,
don't
I
see
guess,
so I don't see a problem. So if he believes that he's got this text and he says, look, these are ancient Egyptian texts, and he's got a whole big stacks of these scrolls, and he says, look, and God says, go ahead and transmit the text. Okay. And he believes that what he's transmitting is found on those documents, but it's not. So
but I guess again, that's kind of where I think the Book of Abraham would be in its own category.
it's not in its
Just
own it's not its own category because that's how anything would work.
well, in its own category in the sense of like Old Testament books and even as far as I know, other Book of Mormon and Pearl of Great Price books
Well, the
don't
Book of
have
Mormon's the
the,
same. Book of Mormon's in the same boat.
yeah, but they don't have the facsimiles and the little intro specifically
Yeah, they
worded
don't have
that way.
something that Egyptologists today say, yep, this is not the same transmission. Joseph Smith wouldn't have known that, but yeah, it's not the same. So whatever he produced, he didn't produce from this document from a normal translation process that we today as Egyptologists would use.
And I think that's where my question kind of comes from because I know
Yeah,
like
so
I've
my
heard
question
the
is if that's true, where did the Book of Abraham come from then?
well, I was going to say the I know it's a misconception that I've heard is people think Joseph said he like was basically some scholar who's translating it, which I know is not the case.
Yeah,
Exactly
he
what you're
never
saying
claimed
is
that. Yeah.
he it
Yeah.
was a supernatural thing. He's not claiming to be some smart guy. So yeah, we're totally on
Yeah,
the
it
same
had
page.
it had to have been, yeah.
Yeah, I guess then that kind of almost like furthers the point of if it is by his own admission, like through the power of God, and it is a he's claiming it's a supernatural process.
That might be what he believes. Yeah. Well, it is a supernatural process because that's what he is consistently claiming that's what it is. I don't know what
Yeah,
these things say. God says here's what's on them, and he writes it out.
yeah, and then that's where I would
That's
kind of compare it to like all the other prophets, where if you're a prophet and you're basically saying this is of God or from God, or I'm giving you
uh
this message from
and
God,
it is. And if you've read the book of Abraham, it is.
But yeah, that's I guess where my like the
The
crux of the
purpose of the
argument
book of
goes.
Abraham is to persuade me to believe in the God of Israel and to accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah. That's its function. So consistent with like Deuteronomy 13, where you've got somebody who produces a sign and wonder that tells me to continue to follow the God of Israel, that person's a prophet.
Yeah, I think you might have taken the words out of my mouth for whatever. Yeah, I think it is Deuteronomy 13. The is that the passage about like if something doesn't come to pass that a prophet says, like don't trust him or
No,
don't
that's
fear
18.
him.
That's an 18.
Okay. Well, yeah, that was kind of the verse I have in the back of my
Yeah,
mind. I know there's a
yeah,
couple
it's
other.
part of it's part of a similar pericope. He's talking about prophets and how to identify and distinguish prophets because it's a very fickle thing to have to figure out who's a
Yeah,
prophet and who's not. And there's no clear direction given to the Israelites in any of those passages, other than basically the only clear direction that they have in any of Deuteronomy is if somebody claims and tells you to go after a different God than me, kill them.
That is a very loose translation.
Beyond that, it's just basically guesswork.
yeah. I mean, even like beyond like if I wasn't even a Christian, didn't trust the Bible at all, I think most people would say if somebody says they're a prophet and then had some kind of like mistake, again, not that they're perfect people,
Again, not that they're perfect people.
but like mistake in something they were claiming was a message from God, that would even just like one instance would kind of rule out other like messages if,
Again, not that they're perfect people.
Is that why you
before,
reject Jesus?
huh?
Is that why you reject Jesus?
What do you mean?
Well, Jesus had one false prophecy in Matthew 24.
Well, you have to jog my memory what Matthew 24
Yeah,
is.
he says that this generation should he lists a whole bunch of the signs of his coming, and he says these things will happen before this generation passes away. And that didn't happen.
I have heard that argument before. I think that one, where you could spend some, I know, probably a lot of time there, but he's describing,
You could produce an apologetic to try to soothe over the fact that Jesus says this generation will not pass away before these things happen. You could create an apologetic to try to soothe it over by trying to manipulate what the text is. But the plain meaning, the clear meaning of the text is that Jesus was a false prophet under the standard that you're proposing.
I see what you're saying. Oh, so we are in agreement that it in context wasn't a
No,
false prophecy.
I believe it's a false prophecy.
I think I'm confused now.
Yeah, so
But
I don't hold the same standard. I think that the author of Matthew wrote down something and it may not be correct.
but in the
Or maybe
context of that,
Jesus
when
never
he's
said that.
describing the end times and like I think he talks about like the birthing pains and all these end times events, couldn't
Mhm.
it be at least a possible interpretation that he was saying like A, B, C, D, and E will happen at the end times, and then when these end times happen, this generation that it's happened to will not pass away
No.
before.
He says this generation, he's talking about the generation he's talking to. At least that's what the author of Matthew wrote. If you want to believe that Jesus said something other than what Matthew said, I'm perfectly fine with that too. Because I don't believe that everything written by Matthew is something Jesus actually said.
Okay. I
Because
mean, I guess that's again kind of a whole separate conversation.
it
'Cause I would,
it would be problematic to believe that all the gospel writers are writing down dictation of what Jesus is saying rather than recollections of stories they're conglomerating together to try to create a faithful narrative to convince people that Jesus is the Messiah, which is what they're actually doing.
yeah. And again,
Unless you
yeah, a
believe
lot of,
everything was written by revelation and God told him exactly what to say.
yeah, that's where I'm actually kind of currently looking into trying to formulate a view on like
But see,
inerrancy.
that's not something you could ever prove. You just have to believe that.
What you mean, like the idea
Yeah,
of like,
so like I believe the book of Abraham was received by Joseph Smith from God. I can't prove that. So what I
yeah,
do is I read the text and I rely on the Holy Spirit to tell me whether or not it's correct or it contains true principles or what I'm supposed to do with it.
yeah, and that's
The
actually
same as I do with all scripture.
okay. So that's like super interesting to me and something I want to get more thoughts on. And I had been talking to some missionaries there. That was yeah, at least a year ago, roughly now. Um, but there was a couple questions, and granted, not everybody likes to talk theology and apologetic stuff like I do, so I don't blame them
Uh-huh.
or put any,
That's
harsh
why a
feelings
lot of
on
people
them.
that do end up harassing the missionaries because
Oh,
they like
100,
to talk
yeah,
about
no,
it.
yeah, definitely. I know probably myself and other people I know from time to time haven't been
I've
as
talked to
gracious
lots
or
of people who just love talking to about religion and theology, and especially trying to make arguments against the LDS Church, and so they pick on the missionaries, you know.
probably myself.
I don't know
Yeah.
why they do, because they're just 18, 19-year-old kids. They don't have any idea what they're talking about with all this stuff. So
Are you guys gonna take that?
yeah, aren't you? Yep.
I was just gonna say, so the two I was talking to, which yeah, I think they were like they just started their mission. Um, that was kind of something we went in circles on a little bit, and I feel like we didn't quite come to a conclusion on. But in my point of view, and this isn't even like a biblical or theological position, this is just at least the way I think is like there are certain tests with any religion if you're trying to figure out if Islam or Christianity, whatever, is true.
Mhm.
Like there's tests you can do
Right.
that are totally like
Objective.
scientific, historical, objective.
Yep.
But then once you kind of like get past that like first stage of like, okay,
Hmm.
I've run it through the test of the objective stuff.
Hmm.
Now I can uh not like that you can't ask God for help before then, but like
Right.
there is always going to be some kind of like, religious, personal, subjective experience where God can
Mhm.
confirm something to you. But if that like experience, unless God literally like shows up in the room and like verbally says something to you,
And even
I
that
feel like
wouldn't
that,
work.
well, I feel like that shouldn't like a some kind of subjective feeling shouldn't override like a objective standard, which it sounds like you would agree with mostly, right? Like if your
Do I
objective
think
test,
that you should demote your conclusions on things about subjective issues to the objective standards? No. In religion, no, because that wouldn't make any sense because religion is entirely subjective.
I know that's not a popular opinion. That's my 2 cents on the issue.
oh, okay. See,
It
that's
can only be
where,
judged, it can only be judged by its own standards.
huh, I have to think about that. Yeah, I think I
Well,
respectfully disagree.
so for example, if you believe the Bible's inerrant, you can't prove that. So if you believe that and can't prove it, then why do you believe it? If somebody says the Bible's inerrant, well, first of all, you have a problem because Bible is not a thing. Bible is an artificial construct because what you're actually holding is 66 independently authored documents. They don't
Mhm.
have to be coherent or cohesive. And to believe that they do is imposing something on the texts that none of the texts mention or talk about.
Yeah, and like on that specific issue, I think I mostly agree, but like in a
Yeah,
bigger picture sense, like again, in theory, if you could uh, prove isn't the right word, but like if there is a clear truth claim of one belief,
if there is a clear truth claim of one belief,
and you
like what?
can,
What would be an example of a clear truth claim of one belief?
uh, I mean, like for Islam, if you said Muhammad is not at all a prophet,
Which you couldn't
again,
prove.
I'm
That's a
sure there's,
subjective claim.
I,
There's no
I could,
objective standard to prove that he's a prophet or not.
that's again where
That's just a belief that you have. Like Moses, what's the objective standard that proves Moses is a prophet?
I mean, on any like specific question,
Or that he even existed.
There's probably more debate, like you're saying, on any like specific issue, but at least in principle of like if the evidence was there and you could say, for
Like what?
example, with the Muhammad thing,
What would be an example of an objective claim made by Christianity or Islam?
uh, I mean, the point you made earlier about your one friend would kind of combat this, but I would think for I would say objectively, a truth claim, like specifically of Christianity, is Jesus died and rose again, literally, and that's like
Well,
repeated.
The Rose Again claim is not objective. It's subjective. That's going to be more an argument from what available historical data you can compose together, predicated on the presupposition that a human being can come back to life after they die.
Oh, maybe that's a better way of putting it then would be like,
There's no way to prove that a person resurrects. There's just no way to prove that. It's not an objective claim. That's just you claiming that somebody came back to life.
I guess the better probably way to phrase it would be like, where does the vast majority of evidence lead rather than to say prove? So like just in theory, I know that
Once you concede that a person can come back to life, then you can make an argument that Jesus did, and you can use historical evidence to do that. Certainly. Yeah, I agree. There's a book called The Case for the Resurrection that makes the claim pretty good. It says some stupid, ignorant things about Latter-day Saints, but other than that, it's pretty good.
huh, yeah. I mean, again, to kind of zoom out, the point I was trying to make was mostly just like for me, trying to think, okay, certain beliefs have, while everything is open to interpretation, you can probably find 10 views on anything, any specific view. Most like big picture or worldviews or religions, LDS, Protestant, Islam, whatever, have their like more or less central claims that make them what they are, make them like distinct from other beliefs. So
Yeah.
then,
But those claims are not objective. They're just beliefs that they espouse that are different from other denominations, which isolate them as a unique denomination.
uh, yeah, but I'm saying like if a whether the claim is true or false, couldn't you, at least in theory, like look into that claim
Yeah, you
and
could, but you'd have to just decide that you're going to concede the supernatural or something before you do that.
so you're saying, I'm trying to make sure I understand correctly, like ultimately the foundation is
So,
subjective
well,
experience?
yeah, so before I investigate any religion for its truth claims, right, or whether or not it's, quote, correct, or whatever you think about it, I have to first concede that there's a God. What's the objective evidence for that?
So that's where I would probably agree to disagree and say like for all those, or not all, but most questions like that, there are like tests you can run more or less.
Like what? What's the test for the existence of God? Because if you've got one, great.
Again, not to prove like with 100% mathematical certainty,
Oh,
but
so it's not proof.
yeah, not proof, but it's almost like saying, I've heard this example before, so it's not my analogy, but like if a guy robs a bank and you've got like his fingerprints and his car was there and you've got him on video doing it, witnesses, all this stuff, technically you can't like 100% prove that wasn't all faked, but there's a certain point where you're like, okay, I'm 99.9% sure.
And you know what? You know what you never in that scenario, what you never question is the fact that banks exist, monies exists, and that people actually rob them. So that scenario is very highly probable because of those facts.
Problem solved.
So that wouldn't really work with respect to the existence of an unknown, unseen, incomprehensible being that exists outside of time and space.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I totally see what you're saying in terms of like,
What's the evidence for that? I mean, because yeah, fingerprints exist. They actually are a thing. We can go down to the police station or we can get online to an FBI database and get, millions. In fact, I could send that to every human being on the planet so they could see that fingerprints are a real thing. And we
yeah,
could film people. I mean, and if I always can say like objective standard is this is a cup, and if you don't believe that this is a cup, I can mail it to you. And then at that point, you're just denying reality. But how do I prove that? Well, I can literally take this and mail it to every person that exists and lives right now, and all of them can agree this is a cup.
It's science.
yeah, and that's actually maybe a good like example of again
That's a purely
the
objective standard. Yeah.
yeah, and like this is at least with the way my mind works. This isn't like a Bible verse or anything, but when you look at like different belief systems, there are going to be certain things like, like moral statements where you can't maybe prove or disprove one thing like that, but there might be others where I know we've already mentioned, and maybe there is more subjectivity than I thought, but like Jesus rising from the dead, you could again spend a lifetime researching just that one question, but at least like in principle, if you found his body or something that contradicted what at least allegedly was a clear
Yeah,
claim,
so even if
that would,
I found, let's say I did a DNA test or I had discovered the DNA that science confirmed was the DNA of Jesus of Nazareth. Okay. We actually find his DNA and we recover that DNA and we discover a collection of bones in an ossuary, and we test them and we find out this is actually Jesus of Nazareth's bones.
Mhm.
That still wouldn't convince me he didn't rise from the dead. It would just convince me that the authors of the Gospels who wrote down that the tomb was empty were mistaken or lying. Because in Israelite belief system, the idea that a corpse would come back to life or be reanimated and not something that they would have believed. In fact, they believe that the body that we have would have been decomposed and returned to the earth. And so the body that we raise with in the resurrection, the glorious body, is not a mortal body, but a corruptible. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15. So they're understanding that the actual graves open up literally is not something that's literal to them. They believe that the bodies of the dead are decomposed and gone, that God reconstitutes a new body. So even though Jesus raised with a body of flesh and bone and showed it to his apostles, even if we found the body that was hung on the cross, that still wouldn't convince me he wasn't resurrected.
Well, I guess my question would be like, at least for
You
the,
see
let's say
how I
the,
can get around it? Even if you find his body, I can still believe in it.
yeah, I guess that's my question is, regardless of, I guess the New Testament would probably be a good example, but like, is there any one like claim that somebody can take from a text like that and say like this, let's not even say that somebody gets it right, but like, is there a true original intention of any given text like that, like the Gospels? Or like, is it always open to opinion?
So the texts themselves can be more, they can be more grounded in their context. The more you learn about their historical setting and context and the beliefs of the people who are writing them and to whom they were written, you can come to a closer understanding of what they were meant to have conveyed as far as information. I don't know if that's what you're asking or not, but effectively, could
Yeah.
we know 100% what the text mean? No. Paul mentions all kinds of things and he doesn't clarify. It's one of the reasons Latter-day Saints point to 1 Corinthians 15:29 with respect to baptisms for the dead. Paul doesn't articulate what he's talking about in that passage.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't want to get too, I guess, lost in the weeds of like any specific question, but more so like trying to relate this back to the questions that I have about
Well, like,
the
okay, an
Book of
objective
Abraham
claim
stuff.
would be, I think everybody agrees Jesus Christ came back to life. Now, how he did that or what that looks like actually differs among the authors, but yeah, they all believe he died and came back to life. I
Okay.
think
Yeah.
that's a
So that would
claim in the
be,
New Testament that's consistent across all of the text.
yeah. So like for that, for example, I think basically everybody would agree that like is a teaching from this, we don't even call it the Bible, but just a collection of texts are in agreement on this. And if you
Well,
like,
yeah, the authors of those texts were in agreement on that.
yeah, so like in theory, again, purely in principle, in theory, disproved that, it would be like wrong to say
But
you're
like I
still in
said, you
agreement
couldn't
with.
disprove it because you could just say, like I told you, I told you the other day, I talked to a guy who claims that Jesus didn't actually bodily resurrect, that it was a spiritual resurrection. And he went through a bunch of biblical passages to show me how it was a spiritual resurrection and a phantasm. It wasn't really early Christian Gnostics believed in things like that. So, and they're using the same source material, traditions, and eventually texts that you would use, and they're arguing something. So, I mean, even if we found his body or we proved that he was still dead, they could still claim, no, that was a fake body. That was a whatever. There's an argument they could make that still supports their belief system.
That's kind of my point though, is like at what point, or is there a point, I guess is the question, is there a point where you can draw a line and say
Yeah, when your
this
own claim is
belief,
internally inconsistent. So if you're claiming the Bible is infallible and inerrant, and that means there's no errors in the text, if that's what you mean by that, that's objectively false.
but not just, but see, like even that I would say, I think I know what you mean, but like I wouldn't phrase it as internally consistent because it's like here's a belief and then here's a text. If the text is saying one thing and my belief is opposite of the text, like at a certain level, there's things that are irreconcilable. Would we agree on that? Because it kind of sounds like you're
If you
saying,
yeah, if you're saying so, like for example, the three synoptic gospels have Jesus crucified on Friday. John has him crucified on Thursday. So if you're claiming the biblical texts are without error, that's an error. Or it's a difference of opinion. Somebody's right, somebody's wrong. They can't both be
yeah,
right because Jesus wasn't crucified on two different days. That can't be possible. So
but then like,
that
okay, so like,
claim, yeah, that claim. But I mean, all I'm going to do is, from my perspective, is just say, okay, some of them
yeah,
had bad information and one of them had good information, and somebody's right and somebody's wrong. Or John is having him crucified on the day of the preparation because he's the Lamb of God, and the day that you would kill the Lamb of God is the day of preparation. So John's trying to make a theological point.
okay, so then like with that example, and again, I'm trying to tie back to the question that ultimately I'm trying to wrestle through with the whole Book of Abraham stuff. Like if somebody like your friend who said the resurrection might not be a literal thing, if he came to those passages and then said, I think the those books are teaching Jesus was resurrected on Monday, or would you say not resurrected, but crucified
Yeah,
on Monday,
crucified on Thursday
that
or
would be
Friday.
clearly like contradicting what the texts are saying, right?
Yeah, but so
But now I'm just making the point that like
yeah,
the text would be making
I
one
don't throw
claim.
John or I don't throw the synoptic gospels or John in the garbage simply because they don't agree.
Yeah, but I'm just making the larger point of like they're to an extent are testable claims where people can always say whatever they want and come up with some other excuse. But like at a certain point, there is a truth claim that can be tested, proved true or false. Not everything in religion, but
I
like,
guess what truth claim specifically are you referencing? Because in the abstract, I guess, sure, I can agree with you in these abstract kind of ideas that there are claims people could make that are testable. Yeah, I would agree. But
yeah.
I don't know, I can't think of one. What's an example?
I mean, the one would just be the one we just mentioned about like, again, not even saying which one is, well, I want to make sure I phrase it correctly. The Gospels say, or let's just say one of the Gospels says he's crucified on Thursday.
Uh-huh.
I come across and I say he was crucified on Monday, and then somebody invents a time travel machine. Again, we're talking totally hypothetical, and they go back and they realize 100% for sure it happened on Wednesday.
Uh-huh.
That is a like objective claim. It happened on Wednesday. The one that said it was on Thursday was wrong. The one that said it was on Monday was wrong. This is the truth,
Which means what?
which means those other two sources were wrong. That's really all I'm trying to get at is
Yeah.
to a certain extent, there's a line of truth. So
But
then, and
that's
again,
the
this
same
is,
way with everything. I mean, if you start comparing the biblical narratives across themselves, there's a whole bunches of problems with their, this guy's wrong, this guy's wrong, this doesn't make sense. This is not historically what happened in this war at this time. These people weren't there. There was nothing here. Anachronisms and stuff that occur in the book of Genesis and things like that with respect to Abraham. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff like that. That if you could time travel, yeah, we could go back and say we could go back and check the boxes of which passages in the biblical narrative are not historical. And
yeah, but that's really just my
the
question was
authors
like,
either, but so what? I don't know what that helps with respect to anything with respect to religion.
I think I was just making the point more largely that like when it comes to what distinguishes one, at least general belief system from another, are kind of at its core, like those testable questions.
And
Again,
that's what
not
I'm
that's
saying. I keep
gonna,
saying like what? Like what's an example of something like that?
I mean, I would contrast, well, the one, at least as far as I understand right now, and again, I'm gonna read the book
Okay, so
and want to get back to you, but the,
let's say my claim. Well, let's see, and the claim is that the book of Abraham, we don't have the book of Abraham. We just simply don't have it. The source material for the papyrus is we just don't have it. And if you want to insist that we do, I don't know what to tell you because nobody in the LDS church believes that we have the text of the book of Abraham in papyrus form. We all know absolutely. John Gee, Kerry Mulestein, Stephen Smoot, Thompson, all these people agree. LDS active guys truly believe in the church. They believe that the book of Abraham is a divinely inspired scripture. They know these languages. They've been studying them for decades. They're very aware of Egyptology. They teach it. They have PhDs in these subjects and stuff, and they are just not convinced by the facile arguments that are made against it. And they've written extensively on the subject. And what I'm saying is that their material supports a contrary narrative to what other people would think is objective. And in fact, what they conclude is there's still a lot we don't know, which is one of the reasons I trust them more than a lot of people who are making negative. Well, a lot of people who attack the Book of Abraham are doing it for the purpose of trying to deconstruct the LDS faith. They're not really trying to do it to explore truth. But see, my friend Stephen Smoot, for example, one of the things he often repeats is there's still a lot of work to be done in the Book of Abraham. We know this much, and we still have to know this much, because we've only really had access to the materials to be able to study it for the last few years. And so we've been going through and trying to digest the materials. Plus, there's a whole bunch of research that has to be done in the ancient world to confirm certain things or to find them. And so there's still more work to be done. That's a better, more objective standard than somebody who says, I figured it out. Joseph Smith was a false prophet, because the facsimiles don't match what Egyptologists today say. You're not an Egyptologist. You can't read those facsimiles.
Yeah, I guess it seems like to me, I guess kind of the crux of the argument is, again, I mean this in the most loving way possible, but it seems like there's almost a shift to like an appeal to authority rather than like having a
You have to appeal to
full.
authority. That's what you're doing. You're appealing to authority.
I'm just asking a question about what's in the Book of Abraham right now.
Right, and I'm telling
Yeah,
you that yeah, so for the analysis on the facsimiles, there's a chapter in the book where a scholar went through
that's
and
why
made an
you're you're
it's
saying I
not an
don't have
appeal.
the
It's
answer,
not,
but I'm
no, I'm
appealing
not
to an
appeal.
authority.
I'm not, no, I already gave you the answer. The answer is that, well, for example, um, when you read Hebrew and you interpret the Hebrew scriptures, what are you understanding is the difference between the textual variants that are found in Deuteronomy 32 with respect to the council of gods?
I don't know what you mean.
Right. So, but even to answer that question, you would have to appeal to scholars because you don't read Hebrew. I'm just appealing
Yeah.
to an Egyptologist who actually can read Egyptian, because
Oh no,
I don't. I'm not saying anything other than I've read his book, and I'm just saying you should read the book too. But like I
yeah.
said, if your answer to your question is you want me to read the chapter on the facsimiles in his book, I can do that.
No,
But
I totally see your
I
point.
don't
Like,
know that I think that you can read it on your own. I'm not appealing to an authority. I'm just saying that question requires an Egyptologist to answer. It requires somebody who's skilled in ancient languages to answer that. I know people who are, and so I go to them for the answer because I haven't put in the work. So if you're saying you can't do that, then that means in order for you to read the Bible, you have to take your English translations and throw them in the garbage and go learn ancient Hebrew and Greek and Ugaritic, and you have to learn a Syriac and all the other languages that are relevant to biblical studies yourself. That way you don't have to appeal to authority. I mean, reading the Bible is an appeal to authority because you're claiming that the people who transmitted it into whatever language you prefer are an authority and that they have the ability to transmit that document correctly. It's all an appeal
I,
to authority.
yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. I see the point you're making about like how, yeah, ultimately things that are kind of like beyond our reach academically, I'm not going to be an expert in every subject. So there is a point where, you have to go to the experts. But I
Yeah, I
guess
don't have the time.
I would just distinguish, I guess, kind of the core like crux of the question. And again, open
But
question
what I
to
have do without an appeal to authority is I've read the book of Abraham.
yeah, but if I could just finish the point, it's more that not I'm not really asking a question that would pertain to like the specifics of, I'm not like disputing, okay, well, that Egyptian word is wrong or anything that would really even require uh like even get into the subject of Egyptology. I'm more just asking like the general conceptual question of you know, if he said X and the opposite of X turned out to be true,
I know
is there
I
just that?
answered that question, though. That's what's saying. I've already answered that specific question. Joseph Smith transmitted the Book of Abraham. He produced it to a scribe. He dictated the text to a scribe. They wrote down what he said. He believed that he was receiving that revelation from that text. But really what he was doing, and he knows that's what he was doing, is he was receiving it from God because he can't read Egyptian. So I don't know how that doesn't change the scenario. The scenario does not change because we took what he thinks he's translating and found out it's not the Book of Abraham. It doesn't change the fact that Joseph Smith is staring at a papyrus and speaking words that people are writing down. It doesn't change that because he's not using a scholarly academic methodology for translating the languages. He doesn't know how to do that. And they produced attempts to reverse engineer the Book of Abraham. So taking the English text he received and then trying to take the characters in the text that they had and line them up to try to produce a reverse engineering of the meaning. And Egyptologists think it's a terrible, laughable attempt. It doesn't work. They're completely wrong because they don't even understand the language. So
Yeah.
the only claim he's making is God told me what to say about the Book of Abraham. So the only exercise I can do is academics can take those texts and they can decipher them and figure it out and whatever they want to do. That's fine. But what they can't do is argue with the fact that the Book of Abraham is a thing, exists. We have to have it and we have to deal with it.
Yeah. And I think the one phrase in there that I know I'm keeping you guys late, but I'll try to make this the last point for you guys.
No, it's just
But
we're kind of, yeah.
I got you! Go! Go!
It's all just an act.
Stop! Stop! He's already dead.
well, the one final thing in there that you mentioned,
Because I don't know why any of this, I don't know why any of this matters with respect to the Book of Abraham, because I've already got a settled question with respect to the Book of Abraham. It's very clear for me. So the Book of Abraham, we have papyrus. They're not the Book of Abraham. We have facsimiles. There's still questions about the facsimiles. I've given you a book that my friend wrote about those facsimiles and about the questions that still exist with respect to deciphering them. They're in there. Some people can concede that Joseph Smith may have taken the facsimiles, thought he was doing something, tried to figure them out on his own or whatever. The problem with that analysis is, and one of the issues that they have, that would be a clear-cut analysis. He just took these pictures and he tried to decipher them, threw them in there, and everything about them's wrong. The problem with that is Egyptologists have found that some of the things that he thought are correct, and he couldn't have known that. So how do you figure that? So they're trying to figure it out. It's a deeper question than that. How did he get some of it right and some of it wrong? How does that work? And it causes you to rethink what we know even about Egyptology. And Kerry Muhlstein's lectured significantly on what we actually know about Egyptology and how a lot of Egyptologists are overly cocksure about what they know, and they don't have much reason to be.
yeah. So circling back just to the one thing that you had said that I wanted to kind of finish with as a pointed question is, in theory, if he translated this as you kind of described it, I forget the exact way you phrased it, but saying that
God told him what it said. Yeah.
Yeah, but if he just left it at that and there was nothing else, then I think that's totally fine. I don't see a contradiction
Well,
there.
that's what it is,
But
and that's totally fine.
okay, but the question really is if at any point during that whole process he claimed something or claimed something about the process that ended up not being true. That's kind of like the crux of the question to
Then
me.
he was wrong. He would just be wrong, and so what?
But if he said it as a prophet translating a book of
Again,
God,
we're not. That's the thing is you're believing you've got some standard about what prophets are that I don't.
but not even about prophets, but
Prophets
I'm
are
more
human
asking
beings.
about him
Yeah,
specifically saying he
right.
translated it and tried to reverse
Prophets,
translate
yeah.
it
He
and
can
gave a
think.
facsimile.
Yeah,
And you're
he
saying
can
all three
think.
of those don't matter
He
because
can
of,
think. Yeah, he can think that the papyrus that he has is the source for what he is dictating. He can think that all he wants. He can think
but
God
not just
told him
think,
that
but he
all he
said it
wants.
is.
I don't know that he did. I'm just
It's right
saying
in the
that.
intro, though. He says, this is
Okay.
from the,
This is from what?
I keep on getting cut off, but I just wanted to make the point.
Okay, go ahead. You've got a lot of
Okay.
presuppositions that you keep
Okay. So,
repeating, and you've already said them, but go ahead and
so
repeat them again.
the objective facts of the situation is he and his or whoever it was helped him with that document that you referenced thought that they were translating literal translation, not
William W. Phelps did, yeah.
okay. I mean,
In the
yeah,
Egyptian papers, yeah.
gotta let me get the point out. But he thought they were translating literal characters, so that's one point. He says it was written by the hand of Abraham, which granted could be in a more kind of metaphorical sense, not the actual thing, even though it's strange to put in there by the hand of Abraham. You've got facsimiles from the papyrus. You've got a verse that says the facsimile is on the same page or the same document as the rest of this text. And you're taking all of those plus him buying the texts and saying they're from the hand of Abraham and taking all that and saying, well, all of that was just none of that is a mistake or a lie on his part. And he's still a trustworthy prophet of God because of different apologetic responses of, well, written by the hand of Abraham doesn't mean actually written by the hand of Abraham.
No, it does.
Facsimile.
No, what you're saying is you're actually inferring. I don't know what. I don't understand what your argument is, because your argument is trying to make complex a relatively simplistic fact. Fact. Joseph Smith dictated something that's called the Book of Abraham. Fact. He had a lot of papyrus. Fact. Most of what he had we don't have because it burned in the Chicago fire.
But the part we do have turned out to not be what he said it was.
The part that we do have is not the Book of Abraham.
But he said it was the Book of Abraham.
He does not say this is the Book of Abraham.
The writings of Abraham written by his own hand in scripture.
That's not the papyrus that we have, though.
But that's from the papyrus, and he said he translated it, and it's in the scripture, but you're saying just ignore that it was from him.
No,
and this papyrus he used. I mean, I appreciate you guys making that time, and I don't mean to I get heated about this stuff sometimes, so I apologize.
It's not even heated. It's, I don't know what you're saying. What are you saying?
To try to put it as like concisely as possible, I think there's roughly 4 or 5 different pieces of evidence that overwhelmingly, not with 99.99% accuracy, say that Joseph Smith was purporting that this was literally the scroll of Abraham, and that by God's power,
not that scroll. It's not that scroll. That's what I'm telling you. That papyrus is not that. You keep thinking that or saying that, but it doesn't matter. Even if he believed that scroll, let's say that's the only papyrus he had, he still produced the Book of Abraham from it.
Yeah. But saying that he did something else correct wouldn't make up for the lie in the first place.
What lie? It's not a lie if he believes that.
See, that's maybe where the whole crux of the argument is.
What you're saying is I decided to make up this complicated narrative that's been confirmed by a host of archaeological discoveries that I got right in the text. And then I made it up. I guessed right on a whole bunch of stuff. And you're going to ignore the text, focus on a facsimile, and say, but this facsimile is appended to this thing that is not this text. Well, it wouldn't matter. Even if that text is all that he ever had, which it's not. We know it's not. Even if that little 6-foot scroll was all we had, he still believed it was what he was transmitting to a scribe. It's what he believed. It's not like he's lying about it, because he can't read Egyptian. How could he even lie about such a thing? He can't read Egyptian. And yet he sits down and produces this text. Why? Because he just wanted to make something up? Have you studied the actual text of the Book of Abraham and what Egyptologists have said about the contents of the Book of Abraham? No, you haven't. You're making a completely nonsensical argument that's overly simplistic based on information you don't know. And I don't understand it. You keep repeating it, and I keep responding to it, but you keep repeating it.
You're not all here, are you?
As though it's a gotcha. It's not a gotcha. This is not a gotcha. This is not the gotcha you think it is. And I don't even know what the point is because you're actually presupposing a host of nonsense with your own Protestant beliefs. And you've presupposed those before you even decided to be objective about something. So at the beginning of the discussion, you say, I was agnostic atheist, and then I decided to read Christian apologetics.
Mostly like apologists, I would say, more than like theologians, some like Norman Geisler.
And I haven't read any actual biblical scholarship. I haven't analyzed the texts historically or contextually or critically. But I've just assumed the Bible is the Word of God, right? You believe the 66 texts of the Protestant canon are the Word of God?
Yeah, but based on external
There's
evidence,
no
not
external evidence that would support that proposition. What external evidence would support that proposition?
external evidence that would back up the
What
stories
external
of,
evidence would support that the Bible, the 66 texts of the Protestant canon, are the Word of God?
I mean, all of biblical archaeology would be an extra
Yeah, that
biblical.
just proves that they have historical events and settings that are correct. That doesn't prove that they're the inspired Word of God.
But I didn't say necessarily inspired, like word for
That's
word. I
what
just
I'm
mean
asking you.
a
You believe that they're
general.
the inspired Word of God. What's your basis for believing that?
I mean, there's a lot there, but even just for the sake of argument, not saying like inerrant, inspired word of God, but just the kind of big picture truth claims of Christianity that there is a God, that Jesus was God in the flesh.
Where does it
Kind
say
of,
that?
where does the Bible say that?
Well, yeah, so biblical scholars are in disagreement about whether he claims that. His later followers believed that about him, but most biblical scholars reject the idea that Jesus claimed to be God. But that
I
he
see
was a
it.
divine, but he was a divine name bearer. He was a messianic figure as he was claiming.
But see, I think this is where, and maybe this is a good point to end on. It seems like when some of these like specific examples come up, because we've touched on a few, like is Jesus God? Do the Gospels contradict? Different, questions we can totally look into. It seems like you're saying on just about every question, because multiple views exist among scholarship, therefore there is no correct answer.
There isn't. It's not that multiple views exist. It's that Christian apologists hold one view, and biblical scholars who actually study the texts disagree with them largely. Most of the views you hold are held exclusively by Christian apologetic evangelical scholars. What do you mean?
But
What do you
even
mean apologists?
I guess they're like if you go on just YouTube or whatever, which I know isn't the
Mhm.
most academic way of doing it, but
Mhm.
um, not really reading. Like I feel like I know a lot of people who read, like early church fathers, which I definitely want to do and need to invest more time in.
And actually, most of them would diverge from what you probably believe about the texts and about the
I mean,
readings of the texts.
that could be totally true. I'm just still trying to
Yeah,
make the
so
point
like,
about the evidence, and you keep bringing it back to,
no, but
generally
you don't
speaking,
have evidence for the
scholarship.
claim that you're making.
The claim was, I believe in the Bible because of extra biblical evidence, and then you said what evidence, and then I said archaeology, and then you just diverted it back to, well,
No,
some biblical
but
scholars and some
no,
apologists.
archaeology doesn't support the claim that you're making.
You said
Unless
the
you're just saying,
trustworthiness of the Bible, and I
so if
said,
you're if
okay,
well, if your claim is limited to the biblical texts have some historicity, I would agree with that claim 100%.
that's what I said because you said, was it the inerrant,
But
inspired word of God? And I
that's not what I'm
said,
that's what I'm arguing. So if you're just claiming, okay, if you just believe the biblical texts are just a collection of ancient documents that reflect some accurate historical events and settings, okay, that's fine. I would agree
okay,
with
but
that.
even just given that, let's say hypothetically, if that at least just proved the historicity part and not all the theology and everything, and then I applied that same test to the book of Abraham, to me at least, and again, I'm promise I will
Yeah,
look into the book
we're
and read all
both
that.
in a big problem because there's very little evidence that Abraham existed.
Uh, I think we keep on kind of getting off topic of different biblical questions where you're saying basically we just can't know and there is no truth.
Yeah, so the evidence, the knowledge we have about what Abraham did comes from where?
multiple sources. We have the Bible account, but we also have archaeology, like the trees of
What are
Mamre. We actually have that location that it describes, which then you can say that's just
so,
historical context,
yeah, well,
but I can say
that's
again,
just somebody
still
claiming
that's still
that's just
evidence
some
all pointing towards one thing, and then you're just
that's
saying,
just an
well, it's
well that
possible that it wasn't.
no, that's an author of the book. So who's the author of Genesis?
Most likely Moses.
Okay, it's not, but let's say it actually is Moses. And he mentions something that exists today that we found, and he applies it to Abraham, right? Just like he did with domesticated camels that didn't exist during that time. But let's say he applies something he's aware of and he says Abraham was around it or knew about it. That would be an anachronism. Or him just writing based on what he's familiar with. So yes, of course, we would expect Moses crafting an invented narrative about this father Abraham to understand certain places and events that are close to his own time. Yeah, sure. But we don't have any direct archaeological evidence of any kind for the existence of Abraham, very little for King David, almost none for Solomon, Noah, Moses himself. There's very little evidence for any of these characters, if any. An Exodus, there's no evidence for a biblical Exodus. So the problem with it is that
See,
that
there's
all
stuff like that where it's like, no matter how, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but I mean, we could talk hours. I mean, I can give you 20 pieces of evidence for the Exodus right now, but then you could say, well, that's just basically evidence of what you would expect, but it doesn't prove it. And then I would say, but yeah, I can be beyond a reasonable doubt. And then you would say, well, there's some scholars that think, and then I would say,
no,
well,
that's
here's
just
more
you
evidence.
choosing to interpret certain data that's been presented to you in a certain way that supports your presupposition that the Exodus account is valid.
But you just proved
Yeah.
my point. I just offered 20 pieces of evidence, and then you immediately shifted to,
Okay,
well,
give
there's
me a
somebody else
piece
who
of
proves
evidence.
something.
Give me a piece of evidence that validates Exodus.
There's the Louvre scroll that talks about brickmaking quotas. That's circumstantial. There's the Nomads of Yahweh inscription that show they were in Egypt around that time of the 15th century BC. There's
Okay.
a tomb that most likely is to Joseph because there's 12 tombs there. The Pharaoh's son, firstborn son died, we know almost conclusively. We know that the Semitic people moved to Egypt because there's the Beni Hassan painting. So there's basically pieces of evidence that confirm the story. There's the Ipuwer papyrus that says there were the river turned to blood, that the Egyptian people gave their jewelry to slaves, that the livestock died. So again, there's like tons of evidence, but I feel like you're trying to make the case just to cast doubt in
No,
spite
no.
of
So there's tons of evidence of things that are mentioned in the story.
miraculous things like blood
Like,
in the Nile or the Nile be turned to blood,
okay.
all the livestock dying, things that are specifically supernatural, backed up by extra biblical sources. But since
But
you're of the opinion that you
they're
don't
not
think they're
backed up.
historical,
Again, that's
I have a scroll that's the Ipuwer papyrus from that time that's not in the Bible, that's just recounting events that's
what does it say?
saying I forget all the plagues it mentions, but the rivers turn to blood, all the livestock dies, the firstborn children die, and the most specific one is the Egyptian people giving their jewelry to slaves, which is such a specific thing in the context of the Exodus. But then again, there's people that are going to come across, and it's totally fair to say, well, there's scholars who believe otherwise.
Fair to say, well, there's scholars who believe otherwise.
But I'm just making the larger point that at some point, when there is a testable issue like the Exodus,
Mhm.
well, you need to at least be able to say, okay, well, maybe I can be, I don't know, 80% sure or beyond a reasonable doubt. And so when I take that to the book of Abraham and say, here's 4 or 5 pieces of evidence of him saying, I'm a prophet of God, this is the scroll of Abraham, and that turns out to be a lie, then how do
It's not
I
a lie.
get past that though?
Again,
If
that's what
he
I'm saying
purported
is
that as a
see,
prophet,
that's the problem is you've already reached the conclusion. Just like you already reached the conclusion when you
no,
decided to go from
no.
agnosticism to being a Christian. You made the conclusion that Christianity was the faith that you wanted to follow, and then you sought out evidence to support your assumptions.
Mostly like apologists, I would say, more than like theologians, some like Norman Geisler.
What do you mean?
But
What do you
even
mean apologists?
I guess they're like if you go on just YouTube or whatever, which I know isn't the
Mhm.
most academic way of doing it, but
Mhm.
um, not really reading. Like I feel like I know a lot of people who read, like early church fathers, which I definitely want to do and need to invest more time in.
That's what
No, I
you've
think
done.
you're attributing motive there. I just said I was looking at the evidence and came to believe it was
I
true.
don't.
You might not believe me, but you can attribute motive. I could attribute
Yeah.
motive right back and say you have bad motives, but that doesn't mean it's true or false. It just means
No,
you're
I'm not. It's not a
attributing
bad
motives.
motive. I'm not saying it's a bad motive. It's what you
I mean,
said.
you're pretty clearly implying it's a bad motive to
No,
say
but it's
apologetics
what
came
you,
first and you can't
it's
trust
what you,
apologetics.
but it's what you said. That's what you said at the beginning of the discussion. I asked you. That's why I specifically asked you that question.
I said didn't believe was like atheist agnostic, not sure what I
Right. Yeah.
believed.
And then you
And
started
then
reading
listen
Christian
to the art.
apologetics and yeah, and listening to the arguments of Christian apologists online, and you agreed with them.
I must break you.
What scholarly research have you read that contradicts or is the difference in opinion about the meaning of those evidences that you're claiming for Exodus?
Oh, tons. I mean, I've got a book right back there I think actually two by Bart Ehrman, who goes through why the Bible is unreliable. And I've tried to weigh
Bart
those
Ehrman,
arguments.
yeah, Bart Ehrman isn't an Egyptologist or an archaeologist, so that wouldn't work. I'm
Oh,
talking
you're talking
about
about the Book of Abraham
yeah, I'm talking
specifically?
no,
Oh,
I'm talking about somebody who you have these 20 pieces of evidence with respect to Exodus. Okay. All right. So all Egyptologists or people who archaeologists who discovered these things agree that they support the Exodus account.
Fair to say, well, there's scholars who believe otherwise.
no.
Okay. What percentage of them would you say agree that they support the Exodus account?
That I have no idea, but I would say it's even probably likely the majority don't.
The ma the majority don't. Okay. And what are their arguments for that material?
I mean, I could list a couple, but I don't think they're as strong as the evidence for. But again, even if I can list the arguments contrary, you're making it sound like, I know you might not be trying to, but on every single issue, you're making it sound like because there's a difference of opinion, there basically is no truth.
No, but if you say the majority of scholars disagree that that material supports the book of Exodus, the Exodus account, why then do you believe the minority view?
Because from what I've seen so far, which you can only go off of what you have available to you, is that the vast majority of the evidence leans in that favor. That I have no idea, but I would say it's even probably likely the majority don't.
The ma the majority don't. Okay.
Gonna go fight some nerds?
Do you believe in the Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura?
Yeah. I mean, mostly not quite as it would be lined out in probably most of the creeds. But again, that's like, again, see, we're kind of shifting now to different questions where I
No,
was
I'm just
just
trying
trying
to
to get to
because you
the,
said that you had you said that I believe that I was imposing motive. I'm not. I'm just trying to understand how your reasoning works and how you're making decisions with respect to what to criticize and what not to.
I mean, the point I was making there is mostly just in the most innocent, plain sense of the word, apologetics is just basically defending or finding evidence for a certain position. Doesn't even have to be Christianity. You can be a Muslim apologist or whatever.
Right, I know
But
what it is. Yeah.
you kind of led with apologists say this, and you strongly implied people who actually know what they're talking about say this, which
No, I
kind of
didn't imply. I'm
everything
just
of
saying that there's the majority. You said the majority arguments would be against the evidence that you say supports the Exodus account, but you've decided to agree with the minority,
Fair to say, well, there's scholars who believe otherwise.
right?
because of the evidence.
Right. And so what criteria have you used to evaluate the evidence in support of the minority view? Like what would be the criteria that you would use to agree on the minority view over the majority view?
See, that's where I don't think there necessarily has to be like a systematic response. Like the evidence is either true or false, but once the evidence,
Well,
whatever we're looking at, the
evidence
data
isn't
is,
true or false. Yeah.
well, I mean, what I meant to say was like same thing in science. Like
So
we can all be looking at
if
the same
evidence is true
thing.
or false, then yeah, there was no Exodus because there's no God to have parted any Red Sea.
Yeah, I should have phrased it
If you
better
want
in
to be,
terms
yeah,
of,
if you want to be objective about it, it's all hogwash, right?
I don't know what you mean.
Because, well, people, large bodies of water don't part so that millions of people can cross on dry ground. Just like the accounts of the flood in Noah are absurd because they're inconsistent from what we understand about our own cosmology. They reflect an ignorance of how the world works.
I think I
The fact
see
that
what you're saying, but you're kind of now that's a separate question of just straight up naturalism
no,
versus theism.
that's what I'm saying is that that's so at what point do you make what's the criteria you use to decide between those things? Because if you're saying evidence is what I go off of, evidence doesn't support any of it.
Evidence in the sense of
So like evidence doesn't support that Joseph Smith could have divinely transmitted any document or received any revelation. He just wrote all of it. In which case, if Joseph Smith just wrote the Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, and the Doctrine and Covenants, and he dictated all of those texts, I'd still follow him over anybody else because his theology is sound.
I guess probably the better way of kind of how I'm thinking about it is almost like definitely worth and everybody needs to look into like the positive arguments of like, okay, if I'm saying this, here's the evidence I would expect to see. But I almost feel like a lot of the times like the quicker way of going about it is which is going to sound cynical, but like looking for a clear like defeat or contradiction, which again, like I was even given the example with Jesus, like I know there's a million views, but in at least in my book, if I read the New Testament and then I found out for a fact Jesus did not rise from the dead, I would say conclusively Christianity in the traditional sense is not true. Now, there might be people who disagree, but from my point of view, that's a specific claim and then a specific like defeater that no matter if he did, maybe he did 5 or 6 miracles or whatever beforehand, that seems somewhat convincing. If I know the core of it, like a absolute black and white truth claim
Truly, you have a dizzying intellect.
is proved false, I can now go, okay,
And for you,
both
for Latter-day
answers.
Saints, it's the Book of Abraham.
Well, that's the thing, not the Book of Abraham itself, but just it's more like a test of is he a prophet? Because I know, like, I mean, I would even say for the Bible, a lot of times if you take out one book of the Bible, it's not going to like drastically change,
Change,
theology.
change what?
I'm saying I think it's probably, I mean, I don't know. I would think you would agree,
Yeah,
like, if you
I
didn't
don't
have the
believe the
book of
Bible has
Abraham.
a coherent and cohesive theology. It doesn't. The biblical texts don't have a consistent theology. They have various theologies across the various manuscripts, depending on how you're interpreting them.
Well, the larger point would just be, I was trying to say, like, even if the text of the book of Abraham itself didn't necessarily like wasn't the thing in question, like the content of it, but the actual point of if, again, lots of ifs in theories, if he said, as a prophet, here is this, and then that turned out to be true, I mean, turned out to be false,
Hmm.
that to me would be like an absolute, okay, defeater. I don't really, I mean, it might be worth looking into it a little bit more,
So
but at that point,
prophets are infallible in your idea.
we actually talked about that a little bit last time, and I was kind of curious for your all's views on that. Like, and I think I understand it, but correct me if I'm wrong, because at least my point of view would be like a prophet, again, when he's just hanging out at home talking about whatever, yeah, he's definitely a flawed person and fallible. But if he's saying like this is a prophecy from God or this is a message from God, and that turns out to be definitively false,
Then you just
at
don't
least
believe it.
like but like if that happened, then I would say his standing as a prophet and like anything he says in the future as a so-called prophet would be, you know, I wouldn't have to like take it seriously. And that's why I think
Right.
like,
Yeah. You wouldn't take it seriously if it didn't happen. So if they prophesied something and it didn't come to pass, then yeah, you wouldn't take it seriously. That's what Deuteronomy 18 is saying. But it doesn't
yeah,
negate that they're a prophet.
yeah, but I'm just making that point. I guess that's kind of where I'm stuck at with the Book of Abraham stuff is beyond before I
Because
even get to like all
their
the specifics of
criteria is that the prophet does signs and wonders and then tells you to continue to believe in the God of Israel. That's really the only objective measure they have. They do signs and wonders in your eyes, and then they continue to maintain that this is the God of Israel. And as long as they do that, they're still a prophet. And if they don't do that, so if they do those things and they tell you to go after other gods, just kill them. That's why Elijah killed the priests of Baal because they usurped authority in Israel on behalf of their foreign god Baal, who later challenges Jesus in Matthew. But so Baal comes across and he tries to invade Israel and take over the lands that are reserved for Yahweh. And Elijah challenges him, shows that Baal doesn't have power in Israel, and then kills the priests of Baal.
But what are you saying that
So,
reflects on with the Book of
well,
Abraham?
that's what's going on, and that's what's going on in Deuteronomy 18. But you're saying that if a prophet makes a mistake, they're not a prophet anymore if they think that they're acting for God. And that they know the difference, and you know the difference, and everybody knows the difference. And so Moses could go in and out of being a prophet. So if he prophesied something or said something, rather than just not being afraid of it, as Deuteronomy 18 says, they're supposed to not believe him anymore.
Yeah, I think you've pretty much got what
Yeah.
I'm saying.
So
But
if
even
Moses,
beyond,
after leading them out of Egypt, if Moses makes a mistake and claims that God told him to do something, then he's no longer their prophet.
yeah, but I just would specify not in terms of like a minor misspoke kind of thing or like even disobeyed willingly, but like literally saying
Like
a message.
producing a text called the Book of Abraham and believing the papyrus in your possession are the source of that document.
But not just believing, but like stating that it is in the affirmative, claiming that it is, and then being proven otherwise. Like if Abraham came out and said, God told me we need to get up and travel a mile today.
Which has never happened, so I don't have to worry about that.
Wait, you moved
Because
the
because
example.
your example with the Book of Abraham's never happened, so I don't have to worry about that.
I mean, that's I guess where we would agree to disagree is just
So you
those.
believe you believe that the Book of Breathings that we have is the source of the Book of Abraham. You believe that.
Probably the most, again, I
You
might
have to believe
be,
that. I don't know. I think that's what your whole point is.
I mean,
Despite
you
everybody
guys,
claiming it's not, you believe that it is.
yeah, but
And
you guys
so
as my witness, I'm just trying to speak out loud and think as common sensely as possible, which I know I could be off. When I see the papyrus that's found and all the
do
evidence
you
prior to this like rediscovery is that he said it was from the hand of Abraham. We have evidence that
he
he
said what he
released
was
his.
transmitting was God revealing something that was written by the hand of Abraham. Yes.
But see, you're even even the word choice is still you're saying
No,
transmitting.
that's what it
Makes
would have to
them,
be. The problem with it is, Shane, is you've got this like I've already decided that these words mean this thing and this means this and he meant this. So you're imposing the motive here. So you're
okay, but
identifying what Joseph
why does it say translated and why are you choosing to use the word transmitted every time when it says translated?
because
Doesn't that seem like a
transmitted is what Joseph Smith meant when he used the word transmitted.
oh, but see, that's where we disagree, is because when I go to the text,
We can't disagree because that's actually what he meant.
I mean, I would hope this is at least beneficial for you guys listening, but if I go to the text and I point out a word and
No,
then
they
he
already
said,
know that translated in Joseph Smith's vernacular meant transmitted. Because
okay,
that's
so
what
we
he meant
go
when
to
he
King
says
Follet discourse
we
and it
believe the
says
Bible, we believe the Bible, we believe the Bible to be the word of God as far as it is translated correctly. He didn't mean translated from Greek and Hebrew into English. He meant as long as the concepts in the biblical canon are communicated properly, because that's what he taught on for the 20 years that he lived after he established the church.
but see,
Because that's
even
what
now,
he,
you're still making it more abstract because he put out
I'm
his
not
own
making
Joseph
it
Smith
abstract,
translation, and there's
which
papyruses
is
that.
which right there is a perfect example. It's not a translation. The Joseph Smith translation is not a translation.
So the Joseph Smith translation is not a
Is not
translation.
a
When it says
translation. Yeah,
translation here, it's not a
it's a
translation.
it's a
When it
no.
says God was God from all of
Shane,
eternity here,
Shane,
it doesn't mean
again.
God was God from all
Right.
eternity.
No, no.
I
Again,
understand that correctly.
you're the one playing the semantic game. He is
I'm
not.
reading off of this piece of paper, and you're
I
saying
know, but
doesn't mean that.
no. Translated, you're thinking what? It means that he academically translated one language into another.
So should I file a report with the church to say translates to transmit because that's the correct word there, and then this is
No,
actually incorrect?
no, you should go to a Webster's 1820 dictionary and look at the word translated and see what the definition of it is, because that's
That's
the
not
word
going to
he
say anything
believes.
about language.
It's going to talk about transmitting things. Translating things is taking something and transferring it from one place to another. Transmitted. He transmitted the Book of Mormon. He transmitted the Book of Abraham. Transmitted is the more appropriate term from the way we understand the words today. He transmitted the text. He didn't translate it. He couldn't translate the Book of Mormon because he didn't read whatever script was on it. It was a dead language. He could not read Egyptian. He can't claim that he could read Egyptian. He specifically says, I can't read Egyptian. I don't know this text. I don't know this language. So how could he have been claiming it was a translation? And the reason is he's not, any more than he's claiming the Book of Mormon is. And the Joseph Smith, calling it the Joseph Smith translation, is an exact example of what I'm talking about, because what ancient language is he translating from? And the answer is none. He's using a King James Bible. He opens it up and he's producing more text out of what? Revelation. But he calls it a translation because that's how he understood the word. He believed that whenever God revealed something to him, he was translating it because he is the means by which it is being communicated into English and being told to the scribes who are recording it. So you think I'm playing a word game. I'm not. I'm actually using a historical analysis of what he's actually doing. So translated is not from one language to another. That's a facile and weak argument predicated on ignorance of what's actually happening in Joseph Smith's day. And your claim to the King Follet sermon, that's simply because you've never read the sermon or studied the materials or have any idea what LDS theology is, which is basically the crux of most of your arguments today. You have no idea what you're talking about. You've lazily looked up a few things, and then you've come to spit them out to missionaries, and you've been doing it apparently for years. Have you read the Book of Mormon?
Parts of it, not the whole thing.
Right. In 4 years, you've never read the Book of Mormon. You don't know the Book of Abraham very well, and you think I'm wrong for trying to question your motives when you say I was an agnostic atheist and then I started reading Christian apologetics. I've never read biblical scholars. I agree that Exodus information, even though the majority of scholars disagree with what its interpretation and meaning is, I still infer that it supports my presuppositions about the Bible. And I'm supposed to what? Think that you're open-minded and objective? No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Your conversation really is most entertaining. If you would close the door on your way out.